Hello and welcome, I'm Ceri Griffiths and I'm here in association with Katy Designs, and I'm very excited about my newest mould. Now, it's a very special mould to me, and it's a very special mould probably to quite a few people because it's all about dragonflies. Now, within many cultures, dragonflies are very significant. I know in the Orient, because a dragonfly is born in water then moves to air, it's a very big symbol of change. Some cultures believe that dragonflies are actually spirit messengers. For me, I find that whenever I have a big decision to make, I usually end up seeing a dragonfly, whether it's in real life or whether it's on jewellery or the pattern on a shirt or something. One appears to me, and it sounds a bit fluky, but to me it works. Now if we look at the cake here on my left, I've just put the basic elements onto the cake, and what you can see is that I've got a wired dragonfly, which could also be made as a flat dragonfly, just sticking it directly to the cake. I've also given you a smaller dragonfly, two different clumps of bulrushes. Now those bulrushes could actually be cut into smaller sections if you wish to use them otherwise. I've also given you a pile of rocks to give you rocks around a pool, but those rocks work equally as well if you want to make them into clouds. So lots of different uses for them. Now, before we actually take a look at the mould and the elements I'm going to make from the mould, I'd like to explain the sugar paste or fondant I'm using is any shop-bought sugar paste or fondant, and I've added some Tylo powder to it. For more of an explanation to that, if you refer to my other video, which is adjusting sugar paste and fondant for use in moulds, it will give you in detail explanations of everything. So here in front of me is the entire mould. Now at the top I've got a one-piece dragonfly which can come out quite easily in one piece, although if you wanted to wire this dragonfly you could wire it in the body and the paste would hold its own weight, or you could actually take the separate wings off and do the same process that I'm actually going to be doing and showing you for the larger dragonfly. Now the larger dragonfly I've made in sections because it's my total intent for that to be wired. Each wing is wired separately, so is the body. However, you could quite easily lay the wings onto the cake and lay the body down the middle of it so it wasn't wired. The options are completely up to yourself. As far as the bulrushes go, we've given you two different shaped clumps. And what I would say is when you've got them out, you can look at them, and there are sections where you can actually cut the bulrushes into smaller clumps so you don't have just the repetition of the two styles. You could make a whole sequence of bulrushes and add them as different elements. And down here I've given you what I call the river boulder wall sort of effect. Now this I've used on the cake, I've used it for clouds, but I gave you an irregular shape purely because if you were to just pop this out and just keep adding it to the side of the cake, it would look too similar. But you can actually take sections of this out. As you can see here, you could take another section out here and you could build the wall yourself. Also, you could lay this flat onto a cake board and it would give you a very, very rustic cobbled surface. So lots and lots of uses in this mould. So let's get started and let's look about creating the wire support for the body. So I have in front of me a 26 gauge wire. It's about a quarter length. I would say choose how long the wire is depending on how far above you need to have your dragonfly. So taking the wire, I'm going to lay it down inside the body about 3/4 of the length down. There's no point going all the way to the end of the tail because, to be honest, that's just too fine a place for you to have it. Then taking a pair of pointy nose pliers, I will hold it and bend it over. And what I've done is I bend it over and I'll pinch it so that's a nice tight little fold. Now once I've got this, I'll lay it back in here again so that the wire is sat from the middle of the head 3/4 of the way down. I'm then going to put my finger in the middle of where the body is and bend it back up again. Now what I'm aiming to do, obviously a bit of housekeeping here, is I've created a T shape in my wire. So this part will be the head, that bit will be the tail. So when I lay it on here, the join should be in the middle of this body here. I do this sometimes with butterflies as well, if I'm doing a bigger butterfly and I want longer support. If you are in doubt, just hold it back over, and as you can see, from here to here. So that's my wired section ready to go. I can set that to one side. Now, as with any of the moulds I use here at Katy Sue, I will actually use a little bit of cornstarch or corn flour just to dust my mould. And dusting the mould is all about removing any excess moisture from the mould. So give it a good old dust and then give it a bit of a knockout just so that there's no excess in there. Then for the purposes of this video, I'm going to use like a damson colour because I think that's possibly going to show up better and show you better where I'm putting the wire when I add the wire to it. So taking my paste, make sure it's kneaded, then a little bit sticky hands today, then roll it into a basic sausage shape. Now it doesn't have to be the same length or width as that because you're going to remove the excess anyway. I find if I work at the tail first, a little bit of cornstarch on my fingers, just rocking action, just get the bulk of the paste in there and then take the excess off the end. Then I'll work my way along and I'll spend a bit more time working that paste up. Now if you have too much paste, you can always take it off with a knife. Now I use a plastic knife or a modelling tool. I would not recommend using a metal blade because you don't want to actually ruin your mould. I put my finger on to support the paste and work my way from the centre outwards. So now that I can see the edges of my dragonfly, I just want to make sure that that's fully embedded down into the mould. The next thing I do is open it up slightly just so I can see that there's no fringing around the edges, which are going to give me a bit of a messy result. Then taking my plastic knife again, or you could have a sculpting tool, whatever you're using, I'm going to come in and I'm going to give it a bit of an indent down the centre of the body. That's there purely to give me somewhere to house that wire. So let's get some edible glue ready. And a bit of a glue brush. Now, you're going to need some sort of modelling tool. I'm using a veining tool. You could use a ball tool. You could anything that you can manipulate the paste because your fingers are going to be too big to manipulate the paste. You're going to need a tool. Now if you don't have any tools at all, I would look around the house and find something that's got a point to it that you can actually work with. So I'm going to take my wire, take a little bit of edible glue, and I'm just brushing the wire. The wire needs to be damp, it doesn't need to be soaking wet. So there you go, so I've got just enough on there. Now I will rest that into the body. It should fit into that groove there. Now you're going to need to support the central wire while you work on it, or else it's going to flop all over the place. Use your modelling tool just to push that wire down into the paste. And once it's just starting to sink in, push the paste in from either side. Now I'm using the flexibility of the mould to allow me to catch the edge and push it inwards, because you don't really want to be able to see this wire when it's finished, and also if it's completely invisible you know that it's embedded into the body. If I turn this round, when it comes to the head I do the same process, however there's more to cover up there. If you find you have difficulty there, there is nothing wrong with taking just a small pinch of the paste that you used, lay that on top and then work it down into the head, just so that the paste is completely encompassing that wire. Now there's one more thing I do before I take this out. The dragonfly will naturally have a flat undersurface to itself, but what I tend to do is, and don't ask me what this word is, I say snook it. Snook it means if I give the mould a little bit of a squeeze, what that does, it rounds the body ever so slightly, but then it makes sure the paste is fully in contact with that wire. I then very carefully work it so that it drops out. Don't go pulling it out by the wire, because what you'll do is you'll end up damaging it. Now your instinct would be to stand this up somewhere to let it dry. I don't. Lie it down on a flat surface, making sure the tail is nice and flat, and leave that for 24 hours to dry. Once it's been dried for 24 hours, then you'll have dragonfly bodies that are actually substantial and will hold up their own weight. These are something you can definitely do in advance, and it's one of those things that's a little time consuming to do. So if you've got half an hour, do 4 or 5 dragonfly bodies, let them fully dry, then put them in a storage box that's damp free and dust free, and then you've got them for the future. So I'm going to set this to one side now, and then we're going to look at doing the wings. Now when it comes to the wings, I'm just going to do one wing, but it's the same process for every single wing. The gauge of the wires that I'm using for the wings are slightly thinner than the body. These are actually a 28 gauge, because when you tape it all together, you're going to have 4 28 gauge and 1 26 gauge wire all taped together, so they're going to be relatively strong. You don't need to do anything with this except cut it. Again, I've used a quarter length, and I would say quarter length is more than long enough for this. It's purely there to go into the wing and down the body slightly. I'm going to take my cornstarch or corn flour, and I'm just going to dust my wing enough just to make sure there's no moisture. Tap it out as normal. I find if I start at the base of the wing outwards, it works best for me. There's no reason why you couldn't work in the opposite direction. As always, I've probably got too much paste here, but that's the way I normally do it, and I can also take off the excess. Every bit of this dragonfly is made with the adjusted paste that I spoke about earlier on. Now, you could use other pastes for this, but the trouble is you have to make sure that they're not too stretchy, because it could cause you problems. If there's one thing about a Katy Sue mould that I've found, it's they've got a lot of detail, but they release so easily that a lot of time my fingers will pull the paste back out. And if it's, say, a gum or a flour paste, that's a stickier paste to start with, and you may find it actually pull out easier. So I'm using cornstarch or corn flour on my fingers, working all the way to the end of the wing. Then I use the pad of my thumb to wipe that off. I could have used my modelling tool to do exactly the same thing. So working my way back around, and come in and press down to make sure that's flush. Now, we've made the depth of the wings the exact depth to be able to house the wire, so there's no need to leave an extra ridge. If you want to come in with a rolling pin just to flatten the back, by all means flatten the back. Then if you open it out just to make sure you've got nice clean edges. Now with any flexible mould, let the mould get the paste out for you. Don't go in digging it around. These will actually flex very, very well. And what I'll do is, I don't want it to distort the wing shape, but as you can see, it will drop out. If I try and pull it, what will happen is I'll overstretch one of the wings, or I could squash some of the detail in it. So I have my first wing there. Let's just pick this up between my finger and thumb. Now, there are grooves and details put into this wing. If I turn it slightly, you can see there is a thicker area there. I put that into the mould as the place to actually put the wing wire, so the wire would go in through there. So I'm going to take my wire, I'm just going to dip the very end into edible glue, wipe off the excess, and holding this between my finger and thumb, I'm going to drill this in, and by drilling I'm going to turn the wire slightly. You will feel it go in, and I'm aiming to get at least halfway into the wing. Now I know, because I can feel it, that it's up to about this join here. Okay, personal preference, I like that up there. And I give the end of it just a slight pinch, just to make sure that it's nice and secure. Then lay that down somewhere flat. Again, leave it for 24 hours. If you're in a hurry, you could leave it for maybe 4 or 5 hours, but just for secure sake, actually leave it 24 hours. If you were going to make these in a hurry, maybe put an extra pinch of Tylo into the paste. That way it'll dry quicker on you. Leave it on a flat surface to dry, and then when you have them, they will all be dried nicely. Again, this is one of those things that you can actually make in advance without having to construct the dragonfly. Let's put them in the right order. Let's now get on and do the exciting bit, which is bringing this to life with some dusts. So here I have a pale blue pre-dried dragonfly body that I'm going to be working on. Now I'm using just a soft brush. I'm not using a dusting brush, it's just a soft brush, because I want to get into all the little nooks and crannies that we've got within the design. I'm using a cornflower blue food dust colour. If you're someone who likes metallics, dragonflies come in so many different styles and versions. You could really go to town with this, put hand painted details on the body, but for this video I'm just going to show you the basic, and then it's up to you to take it one step further. So I'm going to take quite a bit of my dust and I'm going to saturate the body with it, just to get a really intense colour. You may find that if you're using a colour and it's not taking on the colour, if you were to mix it with alcohol, you could paint this with the mixture of alcohol and dust food colour, just to give you the intensity you were looking for. So we've got my basic dragonfly there. He's nice and blue now. Now there's one more thing I need to do before I go anywhere near steaming it or glazing it, and that's I need to actually do the eyes on it. So I'm using lemon extract here. You could use alcohol. I tend to steer away from using alcohol, so it's your choice. I'm taking a little bit of black dust food colour. I only need a little bit. I'm just painting 2 dots for the eyes. And if you're anything like me, immediately put the lid back on the dust, because I can be a bit a clumsy person and I will knock it all over the place. Then taking a fine brush, I find if you look at your dragonfly and very carefully, you can go in and paint the eyes in. Now we've made them quite pronounced because on the real insect they are quite pronounced, but that actually helps in painting. It does mean you've got quite a nice surface to work upon. So as you can see now, I've put the eyes on that and it really makes them pop. Let's put that to one side, that out the way. Now, obviously what would happen now is if I left this as it is, the dust would fall off it. So there are options. You can pass it through the steam of a kettle, which will actually just make sure it sets up nicely. Or what I'm using here is I'm just using an edible food glaze. So choices are yours, spraying or steaming. If you're someone who uses flowers, you could actually dip this as well into glaze. So I'm going to take this off screen a second just to spray it, because obviously I don't want to spray my own work surface. Right, just with a little bit of a spray, you can see it just gives it a really nice sheen. And that's what I'm looking for. So the one I'm actually going to be building in a moment, I actually did exactly the same process and I used vine green on there instead. The dragonflies come in very, very vibrant colours, so you can never go wrong with making a bright body. So let me clear up this mess and then I'll get the pearl luster dust in and we'll actually look at finishing off the wings. So here I've got my 4 wings. They've dried overnight, they're on wires, they're nice and secure. They're white. And I'm actually going to make them even shinier, because if I put anything like a pearl luster or a satin dust on them, it really brings out the detail. So again, I haven't got a dusting brush, I've just got an old battered soft brush, which is my favourite because I can work it down into all of the little nooks and crannies within the wing. I'm trying to brush back and forth, which will almost polish these up. It'll bring in all of that extra detail. Once you've worked it in there, these are another thing you're going to have to pass through the steam of a kettle, or you're going to have to give it a little bit of a spritz with an edible glaze. Now when you use an edible glaze, whether you're spraying it or whether you're actually dipping them, you're going to have to let them sit for about 20 minutes just for any moisture to re-evaporate again. Okay, so in front of me I've got my 4 wings and I've got my body. They've all been dusted, they've been steamed, they've been glazed, they're completely dry, ready to handle. The only other thing I've got here is I've got 3rd width florist tape. Now I'm actually using white. You could use whatever colour is actually suitable to your project. Now don't forget, if you're using florist tape, you need to give it a bit of a stretch, because stretching it will release the surfaces that will make it stick. Now with each of the wings, to stop them spinning around too much when you assemble them, if you wrap just a little bit of tape around the wing wire and then slide it up into the wing and then come down, I would say it's probably about 1 inch. You don't need to go all the way to the bottom. The more tape you put on the wire, the more bulky the stem will be. Now I've already done those 3, but I also need to do the same thing with my dragonfly body. Give it a little bit of a twist. Push that up under the body and then come down about 1 inch. So that's ready to go. Now, I have found when I do the assembly, it's better if I actually lay the wings out where I know they're going to be, so I can get the pairing correct. I'll take my larger wing and I will actually start my tape around it. I'll give it a little bit of a kink at a 90 degrees, and then I'll take my next one, which is a smaller one, give that a kink. Now I'm holding it where the paste is and bending the wire. I then come in and I'll sit this wing overlapping the top of the first wing. Then I'll wrap this tape around and come down just again about ½ an inch to an inch. Don't worry if the wings move around, because they're on separate wires you will be able to readjust them. Now when it comes to the body, I'll take another piece of my florist tape, and as you can see the florist tape will stretch considerably, and that's how it releases the glue or the wax, whichever is inside it. Now I'm going to make sure I tape really quite close to the underneath of the body here. Taking my wings, I'm going to pop them so that they're just halfway along the body. They should line up underneath. And then I'm going to do one wrap with my florist tape, because again I don't want to build up too much tape, and I'm going to pair the other side in. Again, get up close, and again I'm going to wrap this around. Now you're going to wrap this down the wires, and what you want to try and do is try and keep the wires from twisting around too much. The nature of them is they'll want to spiral. If they spiral, they will actually look very unnatural for you. Now you're going to be able to see the wire when you insert it into the cake. However, you want it to look as neat as it possibly can. And on that note, let's just say, if you're inserting a wire into a cake, remember that's not a food safe practice. So you have options. You could put a drinking straw into the cake and then insert the wire into the drinking straw, or there actually are edible waxes that you could dip this into, let it dry and push it in, or you could put it into a small flour pick. So looking back at the Dragonfly from above, now you come in and you can move the wings. Now the wings would naturally be more forward than the head. But if you're doing any sort of thing that represents something in real life, I would always say pull up on the internet and have a look at dragonflies or butterflies, because a lot of the time, especially when I'm making flowers, you think you know what the flower looks like until you have one in front of you, and the same is very much true for the dragonflies. So hopefully you've enjoyed seeing the full three-dimensional wire dragonfly. I love them and I can't wait to do them in a myriad of different colours. But next I need to move on and show you what's on the rest of the mould. So first of all, let's have a look at the little dragonfly at the top. Now, it is small, it is delicate, it can be a little fiddly if you've got hot sticky hands like I have. So, as with everything, come in and use cornstarch, corn flour, just to work into the mould, and then tap out the excess. Then I'm going to use white on this, but obviously any colour you want. I found, because it's a one-piece mould, that if I use white, that gives me the colour of the wings, and then I can actually paint in the body. So as you'll see on the original cake, I went in and painted the body in. Now, there's no way I can get the correct shape for the whole thing, but I too tend to do a bit of a T shape in my paste before I start working. That helps me spread the paste in all different directions, and I put it directly in the middle. Now I put lots of cornstarch on my fingers because, as you've heard me say a lot of times before, I have very hot hands and I tend to stick to things. So I work my way along, making sure I'm embedding the paste as I go. You're aiming to get the back of the dragonfly level with the mould. I would not recommend having it any shallower than that, because you're going to find that it's actually just not going to support itself or come out. If you find you've underfilled, roll yourself a little sausage of paste and actually just backfill it. Now, as I've said with other elements in other moulds, let the flexibility of the mould help you get it out of the mould, because the moment you try and pull the paste, you will have problems. So first of all, ease all of the edges away just to start releasing. Then I tend to push from the back of the mould just to start releasing the ends of the wings, because if anything's going to stretch, it's going to be the ends of the wings. Work your way around, giving a bit of a jiggling motion, then you can start flexing the mould. So you can see, out he comes. Let's flip him over to the other way round. And there's a little dragonfly out and ready to go. Now, if you're going to stick this to a cake or a cookie or something, I would say let this sit for about 5 minutes on a bit of kitchen paper. That way it will firm up enough so that when you pick it up, it doesn't flop around, because at the moment you can see the wings will bend down on you. But if I was to leave this 5 minutes, it would be far easier for me to then actually glue the back of it, put it onto a cake. Also at this stage I can go in, I could paint the body, I could luster the wings, I could paint the eyes while I'm waiting in those 5 minutes. So that's the smallest dragonfly. Very cute, cookies, cupcakes. You could even wrap them around a cake ball if you wish, or on a cake pop. So let's move on and look at some of the other elements of this mould. So next I wanted to look at this section here. Now I would call this the river rocks, river boulders. These are meant to be the area around the side of a pond. When I designed them, I meant them to be on the side of a cake. However, since doing them, we know that these will actually give you a rustic cobbled surface. So say you were doing a cake that wasn't one of these dragonfly cakes, this could easily be on a surface for a road, rocks in a river. Also, I found that, as you've seen on the final cake, I've actually used these as clouds as well. So quite useful. I've designed them so that once you've done the whole piece, you can take elements out of them to actually make further boulders, so you don't have the uniform shape all the time. Now, as with everything when I'm using a mould, first thing I do, come in with cornstarch or corn flour, give it a good dust, knock out the excess. It's quite a shallow mould, so make sure you keep cornstarch on your fingers or it's going to lift back out. Now, you could do it in one colour, and when it's on the cake you can actually then dust it different colours. I found if I take two different colours together, like I've got a light grey and a gunmetal grey here, and I'm just going to mix these together a bit just to give me a bit of a marbled effect. And what this does is when it's actually in the mould, it gives it more interest. Now I haven't mixed it all the way through, as you can see. I don't need to. I want those different veinings as if they're veins in the rock. So I tend to work from one end to another. As I said, make sure you've got dry hands. Work here, and just with this rocking action, work your way along, pushing the paste ahead of you, just so that you've got nice clean edges. Quite a quick element to do on this cake, on this mould, but oh so effective on the cake. When you get close to the other end, you can just thumb swipe. Now, don't pick up this bit of paste and roll it into a ball, because obviously that's already marbled, so the next bit I do would have different marbling on it. So coming in, just tidy up all of those edges. Now, there are two options at this stage, and I'm not sure I'm going to be able to show you on the camera, but I will try. Now, you could come in with a rolling pin and roll across the back to keep that really flat. However, if I lift this up slightly, you will see it's slightly mounded. I like that because when I put it on then, it gives the individual rocks different depths. So if I touch them in, it'll give me even more dimension to it. So all I do is ease away the edges, and this will literally just pop straight out. So if I wanted to, I could come in here and I could actually take elements of this wall out. Just take that out of there. Tidy up my edges a little bit. And this means that I can then continue my wall along. I could come in and take just individual rocks out of here. Because they're rocks, it doesn't have to have any defined shape. However, the texture is the secret, so I could go ahead and add rocks wherever I wanted them. So for me, very useful. And as you'll see in the finished cake, when I did it in white, they made great clouds as well. So there's one more element to look at on this mould, and those are the bulrushes. So let's take a look and see how I did those. Now we're going to look at the bulrushes here. I'm going to do this section. It's the same process for each of them. The only thing I would say is when you do take the bulrushes out of the mould, these two curved leaves are the one to be careful with. So when you're actually bending it back to release them, I tend to get a paintbrush just to flick down the ends of those leaves, just so they don't overly stretch and distort. Now, I'm using green paste here for the whole thing because I like to dust the heads of the bulrush. You could put brown paste into the bulrush and then put green over the whole back of it. Completely a personal choice for you. I just find I get better results if I dust afterwards. So, as with all moulds, I'm going to take some cornstarch or corn flour and dust. Now, every element of this mould has been done with adjusted paste, and as I said before, if you want to know what I mean by adjusted paste, please refer to my other video, which is adjusting paste and fondant and sugar paste for use with moulds. Now, don't think you're going to put this whole dob of paste directly on top of there and actually push it all in. You're not. Take pieces of it and roll them into long pointed sausages. This is just the quickest way. I'm using a veining tool. You could use any modelling tool you wish. Use the modelling tool to push down into the mould. I found because I have hot hands, your finger moisture may actually lift it back out because there's lots of detail in this mould. The one thing you need to make sure is as you're joining the pieces together, make sure you massage them a bit with the end of the modelling tool just to make sure that they've melded together. You're going to be working with fresh paste, so I don't see that this would be a problem anyway. The one thing I would recommend is make sure your paste is level with the top edge of the mould. If you make it too shallow, it's going to stretch when you take it out. So keep all of your edges clean. I don't care what the back of the moulded piece looks like, it's never going to be seen. I naturally keep things as tidy as I can, but there's no need to try and conceal seams or any places where two bits of paste have joined. It doesn't matter. As you can see, I keep stopping and starting, rolling these little pieces together just to get the paste into the mould. I'll do a bit of housekeeping afterwards just to make sure all of the edges are nice and clean. But while I've got the paste in here, if I keep it moving, I know that I'm actually going to have it all into one nice piece. So now I've got the paste in there, I tend to work from the top downwards because this way I can push it down into each of the bulrushes, and at the same time as I'm working down, I'm working any excess paste ahead of me. Now this bulb of paste at the end, now I've got down to here, I can actually use my plastic knife just to clean off the excess. Just take a little more cornstarch just to make sure that everything is nicely embedded. I've got no fringing areas. Everything is nice and clean and pressed down. You can at this point take a rolling pin and just roll over the top just to make sure it's nice and flat. Now when it comes to demoulding this, what you need to do is make sure the edges are nice and clean. Don't go bending too far, because if you bend too far immediately you could overstretch the paste. Then I'm using this finger to push from behind, and by doing that I'm just encouraging it to release. Now, as it's coming out there, I've just worked it enough that I know that it's going to come out the mould. Now this bit I'm just going to turn it over and I'm going to bend the mould back on itself and walk my fingers along. And what happens here is it'll drop out. If you find there's any areas that are not, this is where getting a paintbrush and encouraging it to drop out works. Because if you try and pull this down with your fingers, you're going to find it's going to stick, and that's the last thing you need. Here you go. And there you go. That's out of the mould. Now, once I've taken this out, just take a few seconds to make sure Anything that's supposed to be straight is actually straight. So we've started there, we've got that ready to go. Now, the next thing we need to do is actually to colour it up a little bit. So I'm going to grab myself a piece of kitchen paper, and I'm going to take a flat knife just to lift it up. Now, as I was referring earlier on, there are places in this reed that you could actually quite nicely cut to take sections out of it. So it's one of those moulds that's quite useful in that if you don't want a whole clump, you can take it out. If you don't want all the bulrushes at the top, you could come in and trim the bulrushes off and have a clump of grass instead. So let's move that to one side. Now, depending on how realistic you want these, you could go in before you do the bulrushes and you could dust dark green food colour from the base, and you could dust light green food colour from dust colour from the top, just to give you more shading within it. However, when it comes to the bulrushes, I'm just using brown dust colour and a dry brush, and then I'm going in and I'm just catching the bulrushes. Now, the reason I like doing this with a dry brush and dry dust is because if you look at real bulrushes, they have a slight velvety look to them, and by doing this in a dust afterwards, you end up with that dusty, matte coloured look to them, whereas if you put the paste into the mould first, you end up with quite a shiny finish to them because of the nature of the mould itself. Let's work my way along. I would also not recommend using a mixture of alcohol and dust to paint these, because what you'll find is the alcohol will actually make the dust go so dark it'll almost look black, and also you'll end up putting so much dust on with the paintbrush that's wet that you might have some fallout afterwards. Now, I don't tend to steam these before I put them on because there's only a little bit of dust on them. If, however, I've done dark green from the base up and I've done light green from the top down, then what I would do is leave them sit for about 5 minutes and then just waft the steam of the kettle over the top, just so that when you come to put it on the cake, you've got no fallout of dust. So there you go, you can take a little more time than I've done there, but let's put that down. If I move this away from that area. So as you can see now, that gives it a much more realistic look. And if you look at them on the finished cake, what I did is I used a forest green or a foliage green, dusted from there to the middle. I used a light vine green or a lime green from the top down before I dusted all of the brown bulrushes. But a lot of that is completely up to you. And don't forget, you could do these as a silhouette by purely just making the whole thing out of black paste. That would look very dramatic. Now, let's pull in my little friend that I had earlier on. This was the little dragonfly we did earlier on. It's been sat only a short while, but already, as you can see, I can handle it now because the thinness of the paste has allowed me to have some firming to it. So if I just move this off here to there, move my little dragonfly off there to there, you can see very cute elements. Those would look beautiful on a cookie or a small cake. So, okay, so that brings us to the end of all of the elements on the mould. I really hope you enjoyed the mould. I love the mould and I really look forward to seeing what you do with it. So, I'll see you next time. Bye-bye now.